huge welcome to you, and thank you very much for joining us today. Professor is Professor of Law at Stellenbosch University and is generally regarded, not just in South Africa, but across the world, as a public procurement law expert. He's founding director, I think, of the founding director of the African Procurement Law Unit, and is active there. Let's move on then to the topic of the day, and that is really President Cyril Ramaphosa's response to the recommendations of the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture, corruption, and fraud. This came out last Sunday, and
so I want to just briefly talk to government's response to the Zondo Commission's SCM recommendations, right? I'm focusing very much on just the core SCM recommendations. If you read the whole thing, I'm not going to put everyone on the spot to ask who's read every page of the Zondo report. But those of you that's done that will know that there's, of course, a lot of kind of SCM comments throughout the report. But I want to focus, just for purposes of keeping it manageable, on the specific SCM recommendations made by Zondo. And there are basically 10 of them, 10 numbered ones. And you'll find that already in the first volume, the very first part that was released, but it's all consolidated in the final volume as well. So I'm not going to go through these in detail. Let's just quickly run through them. So recommendation 1, the National Charter Against Corruption. 2, the Agency Against Corruption in Public Procurement. 3, whistleblower protection. 4, deferred prosecution agreements. 5, creation of a procurement officer's profession. 6, the enhancement of transparency in procurement. 7, protection of accounting officers acting in good faith. 8, suggested amendments to PRECA. 9, amendments to the Political Party Funding Act. And remember, those were specific then to procurement matters. And 10, probably the most interesting one, a general recommendation on various aspects of SCM legislative reform. And if we then turn to government's response, and when I talk here about government's response, I'm very much talking about, as Sean has said, the president's formal response a week ago, or a few days ago, and the document that they've now released, right? And my overall impression is this, that government is just really kicking the SCM can down the road. There's very little at this stage that they're actually doing. So I think the overall impression is that it's a wait and see, more to come. There are some signs about where we're heading, but actually, in my view, disappointingly few. I, for one, would have liked to see more substance to the response to government. Be that as it may, let's then look at the individual aspects and let's see what we have. So I've grouped them together to just make discussion a little bit more sensible. If we turn to this first group, and these are recommendations 3, 4, 8, and 9, the response is simply to say that government takes note. It largely agrees with the ideas behind these 4 recommendations, but further legislative amendments are required to make this a reality, and these legislative amendments will be introduced in due course. In most of these instances, there are a considerable bit of legislative work ostensibly to be done. So, for example, on the deferred prosecution agreements, it's a matter that's basically before the South African Law Reform Commission at the moment as part of a broader overview of the criminal justice system. And I don't expect to see major development in that area soon. primarily also taking into account that our current parliament's term will come to an end in 2024. So I don't really think that there's a realistic chance of us seeing deferred prosecution agreements becoming a reality in South Africa, at the very least before 2025, probably even after that, given the legislative amendments necessary. So some of it is I think, probably going to come down the line a little bit quicker. So the suggestion 8 around amendments of PRECA seems to be accepted, and there's a general Judicial Matters Amendment Bill coming down the line in the current Parliament, and it's expected that those suggestions will be taken up there. And then the amendment to the Political Party Funding Act is very much wrapped up with the electoral reform that's currently finding its way through Parliament, and which in itself is a very thorny issue. But again, it's expected that those amendments will come along those lines. So nothing really major here. I think these are fairly straightforward amendments, nothing particularly controversial, although with the first two, a lot more detail will have to be worked out, and I think we will only see these in the medium to longer term. So I don't expect any major movements there. The next category are then these 1, 5, 6, and 7. And here the response is now getting a little bit more procurement specific, but again, very much kicking the can down the road. And this is a response that we basically then see in relation to most of the other procurement specific recommendations made by the Zondo Commission. And it basically says in paragraph 5316 of government's response that the public procurement bill is expected to be finalized and submitted to Parliament by March 2023. The bill will address the Commission's recommendations with respect to, and then a long list, and we'll see this now a couple of times in the next few slides, in response to many of these SEM recommendations. So before we look at these few, let's just for a moment pause on the first sentence of that response. It's the first time that we've had the President himself committing to a particular timeline in relation to this fabled draft public procurement bill that's been on the cards for the better part of 6 to 8 years. If you read the rest of the government's response, you'll also see that the President has now formally announced, made it publicly known, that this bill is in NEDLAC. It's actually just passed through NEDLAC and is now basically going to Cabinet, and that there's now a definite time frame for the bill to be introduced into Parliament by March. So it means that very early next year, we can expect a bill to be submitted. Now, just very briefly, for those of you that's not that familiar with legislative process, we've seen a draft bill in early 2020 that National Treasury put out for public comment, but it was a draft bill, right? So it was just a suggested piece of legislation and nothing more than that. I've read a lot of the commentary in the media, but also a more serious commentary making the mistake of thinking that we've already had a bill. We've not had a bill, right? This thing is not being near Parliament. So up till now, it's only really being a draft, a proposal for legislation. It will only become a bill when it's actually formally tabled in Parliament, which we now know will only happen by March next year. And then the parliamentary process will kick in to deal with this bill. And it is going to be obviously a massive endeavor, because it will be the first time ever in South Africa that we will have a single public procurement statute. We don't have one at the moment, as I think everyone on this call is probably well aware, with the result that this is a major overhaul of public procurement law. It is a major moment in our public procurement system. There are some serious concerns around this, not the least of which is the very, very truncated timeline that we've got to work with. Because if this bill is introduced by March 2023, there's basically only a year for the bill to be finalized, because the current Parliament all things being equal, will come to an end in 2024. We cannot carry over matters from one parliament to a next. So it means that if this bill is introduced in March 2023, it will have to be finalized by 2024. And going on past experience, we all know that in the last few months before a general election, very little happens in Parliament because the MPs are all campaigning. So the business is really very slow then in Parliament at that period in time. So there's this concern that we are really rushing this process, which is a very important process and we shouldn't be rushing. But it is very important that we all keep a very close eye on what is happening with this bill. We've seen the draft in 2020, but we also know from remarks made by various Treasury officials that there were more than 4,000 submissions made on the draft bill of 2020. We've seen a lot of those that's been published in the public domain. My own unit has done very comprehensive comments on the bill that we've also published on our website. And we know that there were very big issues with various aspects of the bill. Since then, of course, a lot of waters flowed under the bridge, including the Constitutional Court judgment in the Agribusiness matter that really changed our view of preferential procurement, but also very importantly, the whole Zondo report came out after the draft bill. And in the Zondo report, the Commission made very particular comments around the draft bill, quite critical comments. So I think it is fair to assume that the bill, as will be tabled in Parliament by early next year, will have to look quite a bit different from what we've seen up till now, at least in some critical respects. So this is the first time now that we're seeing government committing to certain things in that draft bill, following the 2020 public consultation process. So in relation to these 4 recommendations, the President tells us that the bill will have a code of conduct that will set out ethical standards. And that's basically all that government has said in relation to this National Charter Against Corruption. It's very vanilla. I don't think there's anything major in that. I think it is fairly almost obvious that will be there, but we don't have any details. Certainly not responding to the detail that's in the recommendation about what this National Charter should do, what it should look like. Secondly, we're told that the bill will establish a professional body to which all officials who work in the area of public procurement should belong. That's, of course, then directly responding to recommendation 5, creation of procurement officers profession. This is interesting because if you look at the draft bill of 2020, you would see that there's very little on that. In that draft bill, some very, very general comments in that draft bill, but a lot of us have said not enough on professionalization. So at least the President has now committed government to establishing such a professional body, and I think that's a very positive move, which I certainly welcome. Then thirdly, the bill will be setting standards of transparency for inclusion in every procurement system. That, of course, is responding directly to recommendation 6, the enhancement of transparency. Again, very vanilla. One would, assume that that would be the case. Again, really no detail about what those standards of transparency will include. And this is a critical area for any law reform in procurement. What exactly is going to be the new transparency arrangements? It's very closely linked to questions around open data, questions around e-procurement, questions around protection of personal information. It's a thorny area, it's a difficult area, but no detail about what that system or those standards are going to look like. And then finally, a one-liner responding to recommendation 7, and that is that the bill will also be protecting accounting officers from criminal or civil liability for anything done in good faith, unless such person acts negligently. And that again is quite interesting. because it gives us now a sense of the standard against which accounting officers, decision makers, are going to be held in a new regime. And again, I think most people on this particular platform will know that this is an area that's been developing over the last period of time. We've seen some interesting developments, especially coming out of case law. The Westwood case immediately comes to mind out of eThekwini, where there's been some developments about holding accounting officers or other decision makers accountable in law, either then in criminal law or in civil law, right? So criminal in a prosecution. We've seen that Major Peterson case where an accounting officer of a local government of a municipality was given effective jail time for basically just a failure to comply with MFMA prescripts, right? Not being corrupt himself, simply just failing to adhere to the duties under the MFMA. So that would be criminal liability, and civil liability, kind of paying out money, having to pay from their own pockets, actual money, as happened in the Westwood case, of course, then set aside on appeal in Westwood. So this whole notion of liabilities become a very important question and not particularly clear. And now government is telling us that this bill will be setting a standard, which is that you're protected if you act in good faith, but not if you acted negligently. So we know that negligence is going to be the standard, and I think that is meaningful, because negligence, of course, is not the highest standard of fault. So it's a lower level of liability than we've got at the moment. Or the standard is lower, so it's easier to hold somebody accountable than I think is generally considered to be the case today. But then there are some more detailed responses that I think are quite interesting and that require a little bit more attention. The first one is in response to this recommendation 2, which is probably, if you look at all the recommendations made by the Zondo Commission in response to SM, this is the most detailed one that they've given us a whole set of detailed proposals on how this agency, this independent agency against corruption, is supposed to operate, what it should look like. The Commission went into quite some detail about this, and it's quite interesting to see that government very, very solidly kicked this can down the road. So in the government's response, it was basically just said that the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council that was constituted basically a month ago is considering this proposal and will be submitting a plan that will include attention to this particular proposal, this idea of an independent agency, and that this will form then part of the broader review of South Africa's anti-corruption architecture that is ongoing at the moment. Again, I think it's very interesting that government is very careful about committing to this particular recommendation. If one reads between the lines, I think it's fair to assume, I think, that this is not going to happen, that we're not going to see a dedicated agency dealing with corruption in public procurement. I think at best, we might see a general counter-corruption agency that will also have some procurement mandate, or alternatively, we will see whatever the procurement institutional architecture is going to be under the new bill, whether that is a body or an entity close to the current OCPO or some other kind of body, that body will have a counter-corruption mandate. I don't think we are going to see recommendation 2 really come to fruition. I read the response of government actually confirming that notion that I've got. And as I've said before on other platforms, I don't necessarily think that that's a bad response. I'm not convinced of the need for a dedicated agency just to deal with corruption in public procurement. I think it's too narrow an approach. And I'm much more in favor of having a general procurement agency that would also have counter-corruption mandate. And I suspect that that's what we're going to see in the bill. And then the one that's perhaps most interesting, the one that's interested me most is recommendation 10, which is a general recommendation dealing with all kinds of SCM legislative reform. And I've just given you here the recommendation itself in a little bit more detail. If you go to the Zondo report, you'll see that these are the items listed. So there are some more general comments as well in other parts of the Zondo report, basically forming part of recommendation 10. But the Commission then highlighted these particular points to say that consideration be given to the enactment of legislation 4, the greater centralization of public procurement in certain aspects, the better harmonization of the legislation applying to public procurement, the better guidance of public procurement officials in applying the legislation governing public procurement, the better training of procurement officials, and the discontinuance of any deviation based on the concept of a sole source service provider. So those were the specific items that the Commission thought a consolidated regulatory regime should deal with. And I think the responses are quite interesting. So again, there's a part of this very general kicking down the road response also talked to recommendation 10, specifically then government saying that this bill that's going to be introduced will deal with the following things. It will be a harmonization. I think that's the strongest response to recommendation 10, that we are in fact doing this already. We're in the process of harmonizing, and I think that is really music to my ears. It's long overdue. That bill will involve better guidance and training of procurement officials. It will be part and parcel of this new harmonized consolidated legal regime. Again, I think great news. And then an interesting one is that regulations will provide clear guidance on sole source. And I'll come back to sole source in a minute. But already in this general response, government making it quite clear that they're not going to do away with sole source, but that they take note of the uncertainty, the vagueness, and that they will be putting regulations in place to deal with sole source. And I think that's quite interesting, that it won't be in the bill. It will be in regulations. And it also gives us a glimpse of the regulatory regime that we can be expecting coming down the line. But then there are a few more specific responses to this recommendation 10. The first one is a response to this notion of greater centralization. And this is a theme. If you read the SCM parts of the Zondo report, you'll see a lot of discussion around centralization. The Commission really commenting critically on this extreme form of decentralization that we have in South Africa. And it's quite interesting to see government's response in paragraph 5.3.15. Basically confirming that our decentralized approach is the one that's going to remain. So in this paragraph, government says the centralization of procurement will be pursued only where it is feasible and where the benefits are likely to outweigh the costs in terms of reduced flexibility and departmental accountability for spending, delivery, and outcomes. A return to a fully centralized system is unlikely to improve the integrity and efficacy of procurement. However, it's recognized that extreme decentralization has also made the procurement system more vulnerable. A multi-pronged approach is required, which builds the state's capacity in transversal contracts, reduces fragmentation, consolidates legislation, ensures enhanced regulatory and oversight capacity, and enhances transparency. So it seems to me fairly evident that government is saying, we are not going to centralize. This is not something we're gonna do. We will, however, pay attention to the vulnerabilities of decentralization, and we will try to strengthen our system to deal with those vulnerabilities and those weaknesses that is inevitably part of a decentralized system. And I think this is a sensible approach. I certainly support this particular approach. I'm not in support of a highly centralized procurement system. I do not think it can work. I fully agree with the sentiment here that the reduction in flexibility, the reduction in tying up user and procurer is a price too high to pay to achieve integrity. That's not to say integrity is not important, but I don't think that a higher level of centralization is going to return to be a return on investment in terms of integrity compared to the reduction in flexibility and fit for purpose procurement. So I certainly support this response. I think it's a sensible one. It's an area that I fundamentally disagree with the Zondo Commission on, and I'm certainly very pleased to see this response by government. I think it's a sensible one. Then some very interesting comments, and again comments I wholly agree with. Comments where again I am in disagreement with the Zondo Commission, and it deals with remarks made by the Commission more actually in their analysis than actually in the recommendations, where if you go and read some of the analysis of the SCM failures, the general SCM failures, you'll see that the Commission makes some very critical comments about what they perceive to be a lack of clarity on what exactly the objectives of our procurement system should be. And they make some critical comments on Section 217 of the Constitution, suggesting that Section 217 does not really provide us with the level of clarity that we need to be able to procure. And basically, the bottom line of the Commission's response is to say that value for money is it. If you don't pursue value for money as your primary objective, then you're in trouble. And that a lot of the problems we see in the system is because we don't have that clarity. And then they really express themselves strongly in favor of this very stark value for money competition as the primary objective. Now, again, I'm on public record having criticized the Commission for what I consider to be an outdated and very narrow view of procurement globally, but also in South Africa, in this very limited view of value for money, kind of almost a cheapest price approach. We've long moved on from that kind of approach. And I'm accordingly very pleased with government's response to that in these paragraphs 5, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Government is basically just saying, well, hang on, it's not that simple. Worldwide, and certainly also in South Africa, there's a balance of objectives to be pursued. Some of these are stark value for money, economic kind of considerations. We need to protect the fiscus. We need to get best return on our investment in procurement. But at the same time, there are very important other considerations to be balanced. And it's not as if one can just walk away. So this very old-fashioned notion of primary and secondary objectives globally we've put behind us, and it will be a sad day if South Africa now tries to kind of go back on that in a new regime. And I'm very pleased that government seems to say, no, we are not going to do this. We are rather going to pursue a balance. And we take note of the Commission's comments around more clarity in how do we achieve these trade-offs? How do we balance? How do we deal with these policy tensions that are inevitable? But we will rather give that clarity than trying to do this old-fashioned idea of primary and secondary. And I'm, for one, very pleased with this because I think it's the right direction to go. And then, and Sean, I'm mindful of time, so I'm really coming to the end now. Talking about sole source, again, I think with all due respect to the Zondo Commission, perhaps they're not quite procurement experts. They don't understand that sole source, you cannot jettison sole source. It's a well-accepted, worldwide, well-accepted form of procurement. There are valid, justifiable circumstances where sole source is the only one that makes sense. So doing away with it is really not sensible. And again, I think government's response is quite sensible when they say it should be noted that there are certain goods and services that are provided by limited suppliers due to the uniqueness of the product or service they provide. While it's necessary to tighten regulations with respect to sole providers, it is not feasible to completely do away with these types of deviations. And again, I fully agree. I think it's a very sensible approach. I'm happy to see that government is quite level-headed about this. And then just two cross-cutting responses that I want to just very briefly talk to. The first one deals with debarment. So these are responses that are not talking to specific recommendations made by the Zondo Commission on SCM, but it's really woven into a lot of the general recommendations in response to SCM. So the first one then that I think is quite interesting, where government is telling us that while they're processing the procurement bill, and we know that this is probably, if we manage to actually get a bill off the ground, probably only going to be finalized by 2024, and then there will be a period of transition into a new regime. So we're talking about at least 2-3 year period of transition. In the meantime, Treasury will be reviewing the current instructions on debarment, on restrictions. And it's interesting to see that we've now, for the first time, got some indication that there's going to be consequences and oversight of institutions failing to take debarment action, because we've not had that before. We've not had an oversight of the debarment function itself. In the sense of institutions not using the debarment mechanism, which has of course been the paradigm in South Africa. We've not really used debarment effectively. If you go and look at those lists, you will see that they're quite thin in terms of the abuse that we know that's happening, and a lot of analysis has been done to show that there are many instances of procurement abuse that just never finds its way onto a debarment list. And it's interesting to see that the government telling us that they're going to intervene into this space, and we see that there's a timeline. So by January next year, we can expect this new instruction. I think it's a very interesting development and something that we need to keep a close eye on to see what this is going to look like. And then the second, and this is my final point, cross-cutting response really talks to a host of issues regarding roles and responsibilities in the SCM sector. And again, it's not talking to a very particular recommendation of the Zondo Commission, although if you read through the report and you look at the recommendations, there's a lot on roles and responsibilities. And in their response, government has given us some indicators that they're applying their minds to dealing with roles and responsibilities in relation to procurement specifically as well. The first interesting one is this one around appointment processes of senior decision makers. And you'll see here, these include key decision makers in the SCM space, accounting officers, CFO, and head of procurement, and that there will be a fit and proper requirement to be introduced into the system. And ostensibly, this is going to form part of the new public administration framework, the competence framework that's just been approved by cabinet and is now going to be introduced by way of various pieces of legislation into our system. So I think from a personnel point of view, we are going to see some changes in the appointment in the top space of SCM decision making, which I think is quite interesting. And then also very interesting, some comments about the relationship between executive decision makers and administrative decision makers, right? So political appointees and administrators. And government saying that they acknowledge that there's not been enough clarity on the relationship between political appointees and accounting officers. That political administrative divide is not being clear enough in the context of SCM. And they are proposing then a host of measures to tighten up that space and effectively to insulate and protect the administrative decision makers from political influence in the SCM space. So you see it in this comment, and then you also see it in 628, where government tells us how they're going to do this. So there's going to be an amendment through the Public Service to the Public Service Act, through the Public Service Amendment Bill, that is going to be implemented in this current term, where there's going to be a clearer definition of the role of the executive authority and the head of department. And a lot of that is undoubtedly going to deal with SCM. And then quite interestingly, to tighten up, to make it even more specific, executive authorities will be explicitly limited in the sense that all requirements will have to be in writing, and all instructions will have to go through the accounting officer to have any force and effect. So I think there's going to be more protection of SCM decision-making and decision makers within government departments, government entities, from political influence, from executive influence, by way of these measures. And I think that's good news in terms of protecting SCM decision-making. Sean, that's it. So sorry, I've taken a little bit longer than I should have had, but happy to engage further.
Well, thanks very much. A very good summary, and thank you for picking out some of those later points that weren't directly in the procurement area. Very important points. Let's open up then to any questions. And I see Ron has raised his hand. Ron, would you like to come in? And there are a couple of others as well. So we'll first go to Ron, and then we'll go to Sanele, and then Advocate Nsuluba. Ron, Sanele, Advocate Nsuluba. Sorry, my apologies. Let me just quickly give you the ability to unmute. I'll just turn it off. You should be able to speak now. Ron.
Thank you, Prof Geo.
We can hear. Thank you.
Sorry about that unmuting. Prof Geo, you know, there's an expression in aesthetics that speaks about poetry in motion when you're discussing something really beautiful. And when I think of your own intellectual contribution to the space, you know, I think it was poetry in sort. You really have a seminal influence, and I respectfully disagree with you on the progress since your 2015 report. I don't think that we can say that you know, maybe you were just being remarkably diplomatic, but I suspect that most of what you've recommended has not been done, and you had such substantive and really good stuff, and it's just a shame that has not been implemented in the main. That's only my view. Prof, you've mentioned so many things, and I'm just going to be as brief as I can. So could you just, and I'm going to just enumerate my questions. In fact, let me ask them one at a time. So your clarification on the draft bill versus the bill was particularly good. Give us a sense of how we'll be notified of when the formal consultation process will open from that bill. Thank you.
Right, so it will come in the form of a government gazette. So we will firstly, the first place that you will see it is, but we won't be notified. We'll have to keep an eye on it, is when it's tabled. That's the first step that's going to be taken. Now, one would expect there to be a little bit of media, right? One would expect Treasury to actually release a media report to say that they've done it, but there's no legal obligation on them to do so. So the first place that we will formally see it is that Parliament will note that the bill has been tabled. And that's on Parliament's own website. That's the first place that we will actually see the document. And then as soon as Parliament is then seized with it, the first step to take is that we'll tag it, which basically will just mean where will it go, what process will it follow. It's fairly obvious which one this will, because it's a money bill. Well, not a money bill in the sense of a budget, but it's a financial bill. So it's quite obvious where it will go. And then as soon as the committee is seized with it, and will be the Appropriations Committee, they will call for public comment. And they will then open up the process through which the public is going to participate in the lawmaking process. And we don't know what that's going to look like, because there are various ways in which they can do it. It's up to the committee to decide exactly timelines, format, blah, 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 all of that. But that will come from the committee, and that will again just be a parliamentary announcement, right? So the Parliament will just send out an announcement to say, we are now inviting public comment on this bill. Often these days we find it in being published in general newspapers as well, and one would certainly expect a bill of this importance that you will see in the main dailies like the Sunday Times, etc., that there will be some notice of comment invited. But the surest place is to keep an eye on Parliament's website, because that's the first place that we'll actually see it.
Thanks, Prof. If we could just ask you, if you wouldn't mind just letting us know, maybe via Sean.
Absolutely.
So that, you know, that because obviously once the clock starts, we want to dedicate ourselves to it.
Absolutely.
This is fundamental. The second question, and I'm just going to ask two more, and then I'll hand over to the others, and I've got a lot more, but I don't want to hog it. So in terms of the definition of negligence versus that of gross negligence, for us non-legal people, is there a reason why they used negligence versus gross negligence, and maybe explain the distinction between those two?
I don't know whether there's a reason. The only thing I can say is that gross negligence is and one must always be careful if you talk of higher and lower here, because it depends a little bit on, you know, from which perspective. But let's say looking at the perspective of the person wanting to hold another accountable, right? Negligence is an easier threshold to meet than gross negligence, right? So you must be worse to be failing gross negligence. It's a higher standard in the sense of it's more difficult to hold you to account. You know, whatever you did must be worse than just simply negligence. Negligence basically, and of course there's a lot of law around it, so, you know, always depends on the circumstances. Very difficult to in abstract say when something will be negligent. But negligence basically amounts to saying, well, when you took this action, you reasonably should have foreseen the bad outcome, and you did not take steps to avoid that bad outcome. That's in very, very basic terms. Negligence. Gross negligence is then expecting more, right? So you foresaw it, but you took some steps. Okay, so it's still okay. We're not going to hold you. Or you didn't take steps. You actually then aggravated the scenario, or you just closed your eyes completely. So it's even a kind of a worse kind of action, and it'll be more difficult to hold somebody to account. And I think that's the difference between the two.
Thanks, Prof. And then just one last one before I come back at the end is, for me, the elephant in the room about harmonization is the CIDB.
Yeah.
In my view, and I've expressed it on this platform a number of times, the CIDB are streets ahead. They're on another level in terms of how they do their legislation, their practice notes, their guidance, just everything. And it just shows the amateurism of National Treasury in this respect. And ideally, we do want a body that has that level of credibility. And for National Treasury to now stumble over CIDB, and it's just their definition of harmonization is probably going to be something awful. So, you know, whilst harmonization seems to be a good thing, I'm not sure that the current regime have the requisite depth of skills to make it happen. I don't expect you to comment. It's purely an opinion. And thank you for answering. I will come in at the end if there is more time. Thank you, Prof.
Thanks, Ron.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, I mean, let me just say just one word about your last point. I think, you know, if you talk to the other Ron Watermeyer, I think he will easily agree with you on this point around the construction industry. And I think one of the really big questions that we've all had following the previous bill, and I'm very curious to see how this is going to be resolved, is this sectoral aspect, right? This, how do we deal with sectors that's really on a different level? And if everything is now going to be consolidated into a single instrument, who are really going to be in control? Who's going to call the shots? And that remains a complete open question to my mind. And I've got no idea how that's going to be resolved. Sean, I've shared the picture there. I don't know if you can see it.
Fantastic, thank you. We can see that, and thank you for sharing that, Prof.
Yeah, it's very, very fond memories. A much younger me. I should have cropped myself out of that picture because if I look at that picture now, I wonder what happened in the years in between. But it might be as Ron has said, you know, nothing came out of that report, so it probably made me kind of grey, etc.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Let's go to Sanele and then Advocate Nslua. But before we ask Sanele to go ahead, how much time do you have, Prof? I see we're almost.
I can easily go until 11:30. So
fantastic, thank you. Let's go. Thank you, Sanele. Sanele is KZN Treasury.
Thank you very much. Sure. Thank you very much, Prof. Yeah, obviously, I would highlight, I would put a disclaimer that I'm commenting in my personal capacity.
Thank you.
At this point, because obviously there are a lot of things that don't sit well with me. I'm not convinced with the presentation of the president when he tried to put forward what will be the action that will be taken. I mean, the president has made a lot of promises. I mean, we have seen quite a few of them being achieved at the time that he has promised. You know, if you look at the bill, the current draft proposed bill, it talks about the Minister of Finance having powers to appoint members of the tribunal. If you look at the Zondo Commission, it talks about an anti-corruption body which will be free from political oversight. And the last document we saw did not address that. So it tells you that those people who will be sitting at the tribunal trying to safeguard the integrity of the procurement process, should then government found to be wanting, they will still be under the supervision of political oversight. Well, that's one of those things that does not get to be addressed by the bill. So if it gets to be issued or to be processed in March, that means those things have not been taken into consideration. You look at the situation that we face for professionalization of supply chain. There's nothing. I think Prof was trying to be polite. If he's saying there's something, there's nothing. The current document merely saying government should try to engage with professional. I asked this when we were commenting when we had a meeting long time ago with National Treasury. What do you guys mean if you are saying we must strive to deal with professional? Are you saying we should procure from professional service providers? If that is the case, how then are you planning to deal with the middlemen? Or are you saying we should strive to hire professionals? If that's what you are saying, then where is the structural approach into professionalization? Because there's nothing in the act or in the document that you're proposing. And what they said no, we'll be drafting a separate piece of legislation to talk to that. So that means the bill itself, the proposed document itself, doesn't talk to the actual professionalization. So that's the part that is absent. And one of the things that I'm also worried about this document is that I do feel that maybe the number or the lack of scholars who actually participated in this document. I've been raising this question because I've been raising with also the colleagues at National ever since. That supply chain management in its current form is somehow linked to the Constitution by way of Section 216. If you look at the constitutional standing. And now the current bill is somehow would be linked to Section 217. But I'm struggling to find a link where in the Constitution itself does it actually link properly. And why I'm saying this is because the bill talks about procurement. Yes, it's a public procurement bill. It's moving to the tone of Section 217, yes. But now why do we feature supply chain management in all of this? Does this not tell us that there's no longer a space for a word supply chain management or a concept of supply chain management? Then they have to be streamlining, because why I'm putting this point that the scholars were absent in this whole day. Because scholars would know that there have to be a link and a direct historical link. Besides the legislation, there have to be a direct historical link and also the legislative provision that are streamlined to talk to what you want to put forward. Now, you have a situation of a landmark legislation that is going to be passed, but it's all over the show. The wording is all over the show. It doesn't address the actual principles that we are looking for. We will end up now not knowing what are we doing. Are we doing supply chain? Are we doing procurement? These two things are different. Even the historical concepts are different. Now, those things themselves, I don't think the bill is ready. Even March, I don't think they would achieve that. Even if they achieve that, they will probably be achieving with a document that has so much loopholes. Now, you have another thorny issue of the Concord, which actually putting a serious strain on the bill itself to be finalized. Either section, is it part 4, section 4 of the bill that talks about preferential procurement. It either has to be removed, or it has to be amended somehow to cater for what is actually required by the Constitutional Court. But that also is creating a serious doubt that we'll ever see this document anytime in the near future. But those are my comments. I think Prof.
Thank you, Sanele.
Yeah, he can comment on that. Thanks, Sean.
Good one.
Thanks.
Thank you. Prof?
Thanks, Sanele. Yeah, I mean, my comment will be very brief and basically say I agree with everything you've said. And
yeah.
And Sanele, I mean, I think, or my fear, let me put it this way. My fear is that what you are saying is going to emerge in the same form as we've now seen in this response to the Zondo Commission, that the can is again just going to be kicked down the road. So we'll see a very, very thin piece of legislation that doesn't really tell us anything about anything. And we'll just say that further instruments and further instructions and further regulations will be created. So we are forever in this, hamster's wheel spinning around without moving forward. And I think that's a sad state of affairs to be in. And it's far too important an area to do this kicking down the can down the road all the time. But certainly what you've said about professionalization, spot on. And I think, everything you've said should make all of us sit up straight and say, look, we're going to keep a very close eye on as soon as this document comes through so that we can scrutinize it in fine detail and insist on very robust engagement with it, with Parliament then, when it comes down the line.
Thanks, Prof. Just to recognize Masachaba, Fikile, Santi, and Chris. We said Advocate Ntuluba.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Prof. Thank you, colleagues. Prof, mine is going to be a simple one, and thanks for the memorial picture now. I know the person in the picture. Yes. But what I wanted to check, Prof, is the question of your experience in terms of the African landscape as to what would be the best approach in dealing with this, with the situation that we find ourselves in, given that you are playing in Africa. The second one is I'm quite comfortable about the response regarding sole service provider, but I have a challenge regarding having delegated legislation that's solely that extricated from the bigger delegated legislation
Yes.
because then we still missing it that way, because sole service provider is part of the whole process, and I don't think it will serve a purpose to extricate it.
Absolutely.
The other part, Prof, the issue of fit and proper. I mean, this matter is still problematic in our space. And now we want to take it and launch it in spaces, some of which have their own determining code of ethics. For example, if you look at CFOs and other professional bodies, I think in terms of the MTSF, we were quite smart in saying, let everybody belong to a professional body. Because through the professional body, you will hold that person ethically responsible and liable. Then going back and dealing with a very, I would say, an amoeba type of a concept like fit and proper. Yeah. And I'm saying this with all humility because I'm in the sector. And also it talks about then, you know, we say in the military boundary management. How are you going to get to define a standard of a person who belongs to another profession that is already defined? Now you are dealing with actually other areas. You're crossing boundaries, and I feel it could have been better if it could be situated within the MTSF developments where such matters have been projected. They come from the various pieces of legislation in Africa and beyond. The other part of is, besides the continuous amendment of the Public Administration Act, which also is a bit of a challenge, because it would be better if we have a package of the workings that lend themselves in their amendment, not just bits and pieces. I want to talk now to the positioning of the procurement function, because as the challenges within the procurement function, are not only about the roles of CFOs and all, it's positioning that makes the function not to be able to do what it's supposed to do and exercise its independence. Now, I'm not hearing anything that relates to that, because, and the strategic positioning for me will be the functionality of how procurement is able to exist even in terms of its professionalism as a career, and also as an entity that is able to be to determine the trajectory of procurement in line with how Africa is taking the procurement space. And once again, Prof, I would want you to reflect on how do you see an intervention of a high impact intervention in the space. Lastly, I want to say to Sean, having listened to Prof, I think one of the proposals that was made about requesting and pleading with Treasury to have a presentation of the bill would be helpful. And lastly, to Sanele, we are told that it has been presented at NETLEC. So it might be that the one we had and the one at NETLEC, which is claimed to have encapsulated the work of the commission, maybe they are different. We will be able to know once we can be granted that respect and space by Treasury to present to us. So those are my comments. And once again, thank you for your support.
Thanks for that. So let me tie up your kind of last point and your first point together, because I think they are, very nicely linked. I mean, asking about, if we look at other countries on our continent, how have they done it, and what can we learn then? I think that's a critical point of departure. In South Africa, we often suffer from this view that we are better, or there's nothing we can learn from our colleagues on the continent. And of course, it's a completely misplaced view, because especially in SEM, there are quite a few systems on the continent that's quite a bit ahead of us. So if we look for good examples, case studies, then I think there are two things that we should do. And it links your first and your last comment. The first thing we should do is your last comment. And that is that we should conceptualize institutionally, we should conceptualize SEM appropriately. That involves taking it out of the finance function, which, please don't misunderstand me, I'm often misunderstood in this regard. It doesn't mean that we cut links with finance. Of course not. Finance is important in all matters. But the fact of the matter is, SEM is not a finance function. It's an operational function, right? If you go to the private sector, it's very clear. For some bizarre reason, in the public sector in this country, we're obsessed with viewing SEM as a finance-only matter. That's a misplaced conceptualization. So, and that's the starting point in my view. If you go and read this report that I'm handing over to Henry in this picture, it's the first thing I said. I said in that report, we should start with reworking the institutional landscape. And that's what successful other African countries have done. They've created a freestanding institutional space for SEM. In most instances, it's by way of a procurement agency existing at arm's length with government departments. So it's not within a government department, but still part of the executive government, right? There are various ways that one can set it up, but that's the starting point. Once you have that in place, that body must drive a proper consolidated systemic review, which includes the law, but it's not limited to the law, because the law is just one element, right? It must also include the IT systems, the financial systems, the training, all of it. But you can only sensibly do that if you've got the right space to stand in. And that's exactly the problem we are seeing playing out in South Africa at the moment. We're trying to do the second step before we've done the first. And as a result, what we're seeing coming through is not adequately capturing holistically all the elements and all the aspects of the domain. It is forever forcing us into this very narrow financial thinking, which is not serving our purpose. So I think, and that's why I think we are constantly going wrong, and we will continue to get it wrong until we fix that point. If you go to the rest of the continent, there are great examples. Create a body, properly staff it, give it the necessary mandate, and then you let them design a system. And when you get to that point, that entity should also draw on best international experience. And in our context, in the African context, that means going to the ancestral model law, which is a great standard piece of legislation that you should use as a point of departure, and you tweak it for local purposes. Many other African systems have done this very, very successfully. We can learn already from them in where they've tweaked it, what they've experimented with kind of around it. There are great examples. And then we build our own system. And then we will have a system that's both fit for purpose, but also globally benchmarked and primarily benchmarked on our own continent to help us fit into our trade ecosystem, our primary trade ecosystem, which is our continental one. For me, that is the starting point. That's how we should go about it. And then just a quick comment on your comment about fit and proper. I absolutely agree. I think it's again the wrong way around. The starting point is create this profession, understand what the competencies are, and create within that profession the training and the certification of competencies. And then you can measure against that. Then you know fit and proper means this, because there's a body that set the standards, that's got the training, that can accredit, that can certify, blah, 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 all of that. Then you can go to fit and proper, whatever that may mean in the SCM context, not the other way around. To just say fit and proper as an abstract notion is not going to get us anywhere. So again, we're putting the cart before the horse.
Thanks, Prof. Let's go to Masachaba and then Fikile.
Thank you. I'm not going to be long. So thank you very much, Prof, for the presentation. Yeah, I think the colleagues have covered me on the centralization, have also covered me. So that we must just be careful in terms of when, if we move that way, do a proper planning, a proper analysis. So as we also, in addition, we avoid what we've seen in the past, because that centralization will work nicely if it has got competent ethical leaders, strong and ethical leaders. But once it gets captured, then all of us, we've got problems.
Right.
So if we can make a proper research and look at, you know, how do we close the gap if we ever find ourselves in history in that kind of a situation, because those will be your kind of ideal institutions that the bad guys will go for. Then I will be okay. And I think other planning will look at maybe the backlogs. How do you unlock the backlogs? We don't sit with the issue of ESCOM, Kusile, this, that, and they just can't cope with the volume. And I think that proper planning will happen there. So that's why I'm saying I am really quite covered. On the bill, I think National Treasury has put it out there for public comment for a number of times. And I think perhaps us and SOS officials, we haven't really taken an opportunity to go through our time to go through the bill and make comments in terms of what will work, what will not work, what opens us for a risk and what doesn't open us for a risk. Because there was even a meeting where all treasuries were there, SCM people were there, and National Treasury was saying, what else do we need to look at on this bill? And requests were made for submissions to be made, but submissions literally just don't come forth in large volumes, and outside the meetings, that's where we comment. So we all have got a responsibility to look at that bill and make any other proper comment through our treasuries in terms of what needs to change and what will work for us. I think the issue of the accounting officer taking some kind of responsibility and segregating the duties, it will work very nicely. That's why I wish that we should maybe have separated both topics. We would have maybe gained a lot on each of them, but it works. And I think it's fine that we give a executive authority some kind of responsibility, because it becomes very difficult for them where they need to play oversight, but they also don't know how, and there isn't a legislation which requires them. So the separation will kind of assist a lot. But I think on the issue of the executive authority accounting officer issue, because even though they appoint, let's say, for example, the panels, the tribunal, but they don't solely do that. The processes always start with the administration, which recommends to the EA to appoint certain people, and for them is to approve or disapprove. But the administration, normally it's wary to hold on to their decisions when opposed at that level, which says that we need accounting officers that are strong even with character to stand and say, this is not happening, because the processes links nicely from administration right up to the EA. The EA doesn't just wake up, get a list and sign. We would have interviewed, we would have advertised, we would have done shortlisting, and we have done all these processes for them. The question is, why do we put wrong people there for them to hire? Because it's us who are putting those people there. And that's my last thing, is that there is a progress in terms of the investigation that are being done. I think such that has never been precedented in this country before. There are levels of conviction rate, even within public servants, officials. We saw accounting officers being convicted, one in case of the treasury head. So we mustn't cry as if nothing is happening. The bad guys are crying because they are losing, and the good guys are also crying because we are not patient with the process. Let's see how we assist the process and make sure that this good work that NPA has started with it's continuing. Tribunal has stopped so many billions of rands, and millions of rands are coming back to the fiscus. It is something that we must commend, and we shouldn't cry as if nothing is happening. Something is happening, and that's why thank you.
Thank you, Masechaba. Do you want to respond, Prof, or should we go to Fikile?
I'll say just one very quick thing, and that is, Mr. Chaba, I agree with you on centralization. I've said before also that imagine if we had a completely centralized procurement system during the state capture years. Imagine that, right? It would have been a bigger disaster.
It would have been even bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah.
Thanks, Fikile. Fikile, come on.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Sean, and thank you to the colleagues that are in the platform. Some of the issues that I would have raised have been touched by those who spoke before me. But firstly, I would like to say I fully agree with Prof on the view on the discontinuation of sole source providers. And then to take it, when we look at our regulatory regime and how procurement is being guided. At some point, we have been having engagements on whether procurement is over-regulated or not. And you look at the volumes of instructions that we are getting now and then, which have implications on the policy, processes, and procedures of institutions. And if you actually look at it, it has taken close to 7 to 8 years drafting the procurement bill. The Treasury regulations were supposed to have been revised. I think it has also taken more than 8 years to revise the Treasury regulations, but we take it that once the bill is enacted, then the Treasury regulations issue is going to be covered. But in all this, institutions are expected to take what has taken close to 10 years to develop. They are expected to comply to that in days. And my view is that we are being set to fail, not by intention, but it's the unintended consequence, because we are largely focusing on being reactive than being proactive. Whenever instructions or the regulatory framework is changing, it's because we are reacting to something. Where is the role of risk management to be forward-looking, to guide furthermore than what we are reacting to say, to ensure that we don't have other problems in future? This is how our legislation should look. So I'm advocating for saying, let us be more proactive in terms of the regulatory framework that is going to cover a broader scope than reacting to the current situation.
Good one. Thank you, Fikile. Prof, is what
has happened.
Thanks, Fikile. Prof, is this
I haven't finished, Sean.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Okay. My second point is on the we appreciate the protection to accounting officers, but the question is it implied that the protection is going to be translated to the officials? Because when one assumed the role or the function of doing procurement, one was not told that at some point you will be personally held liable. I don't have insurance. I don't have legal protection, but I am part of the process. And at the end of the day, when there is liability, as an official, I am held liable. So is the protection to the accounting officer where they acted in good faith going to be translated to officials as well? The issue of centralization, it is interesting to observe the view that the Prof held, because if you look at the draft bill, the 2020 draft bill, if you look at 43, I think it's 43.5a, it implies that participation in transversal contracts is going to be compulsory unless exempted by the Treasury. And it provides the conditions for exemption. So are we going to be in a situation where it is going to be compulsory? Now, juxtaposing this to what the response of the president is on centralization and the points that the Prof has raised with regards to centralization. And then on the issue of, in terms of centralization as well, if we would have had reports on performance against transversal contracts, the distribution to those suppliers who are in the transversal contracts, and what joy the state institutions are getting from participating in a transversal contract. We never get reports in terms of performance. All what we get is the list of suppliers that have been awarded and the list of suppliers that need to be used. I think more needs to be done there. On the issue of value for money, when we look at value for money, we are talking about minimizing input and maximizing output. How practical is that? Because in our experience in the current trajectory is that suppliers lower their offers in order for them to win the bid, and in that process, corners are cut, quality is compromised. And if we compare this to the American procurement system, where price is not the main determinant, but it's about the quality of the product that you want. What are the implications of value for money in the actual competition that we deal with versus the output and the quality? Value for money is being applied in a broader context, but in practical terms, it poses problems for the end users. My last point linked to the value for money is the point that the Prof touched on, where our legislation talks to cost effectiveness, and in terms of Section 217 of the Constitution, there's an element of cost effectiveness, there's an element of transparency, there's an element of transformation. I am not a legal guru, but when I look at what has happened with the Concord judgment and the agribusiness case, I feel that there is an element of silent contradiction and the issue of transformation. That is why at some point there's been talk of set-asides, and if we follow the Concord judgment, set-asides will not probably see the light of day, because then competitiveness is going to be affected. So I think there is more cleaning that needs to be done, or more clarity in terms of interpretation, because where there is ambiguity, then we have problems in terms of implementation because our interpretation differs. Thank you very much.
Good one. Thank you, Fikile. You were just going off there every now and again, which is why I intervened. Prof, any comment?
Yeah, I mean, just very general. I think one of the really interesting points that we will have to wait and see what's in the bill when it's finally tabled is to see what's going to happen with transversal contracting. A lot of us has been taking the view that you cannot have a mandatory transversal contracting system coexist with the PFMA, purely because the PFMA grants an accounting officer the primary legal power to take procurement decisions, and there's a tension between the two. So if you want mandatory transversal contracting, you'll have to amend the PFMA, and I don't think anyone is going there. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that proposal in the draft bill would be dealt with in the final bill. And then I think the other really important point to point out is the whole question about the proliferation of different rules over time in detailed ways, little instruction notes here and there. I think that's the heart of the regulatory problem we're facing. And one of the key things that we should keep an eye on is that this new procurement bill and then the new Procurement Act is not simply going to give us more of the same of that. Whatever new system we put in place, we must ensure that the legal powers are set up in a way that we do not find ourselves back in the same boat in 5 years' time with a little bit of instruction notes issued overnight, and then they're amended and there's no rhyme or reason to any of it. We cannot have this system again. I mean, that's why the current system is broken. And we have an opportunity now in the new act to set up the regulatory powers in an appropriate way so that we don't find ourselves in that space again. So my own view has been always that it's fine for a central oversight body to give guidance, to suggest how things must be done. But if you want to create actual rules, binding legal rules against which, for example, you're going to be audited or against which you're going to be dragged to court, those need to follow a proper regulatory process. It can't be this overnight posting on the website kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's a point that I've been very, very strongly arguing for, and I hope that whenever this gets to Parliament, we can convince the parliamentarians that it's not democratic to have this kind of informal lawmaking from some office in a government department. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Prof. I put a comment on Paja there as well.
Yeah, well taken. Yeah.
Santi, all the way from Western Cape.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I hope you're well. Thank you so much for the opportunity to listen to this discussion. It's been absolutely enlightening. I have two very basic questions that I'd like to ask, and they are questions rather than comments. My first is probably one that's relatively difficult to answer, and that is around my wheelhouse, which is all around practical implementation. So we're one of the departments that has to take these instructions and regulations and make them work. And in our experience, or in my experience, the devil is absolutely in the details. And it's the area that is open to interpretation that gives scope for corruption. So I'm wondering to what extent the folks who've been involved in this whole process that we're discussing now have highlighted the need for consultative implementation and a move towards making that issue of interpretation less of a challenge. We encounter that on an annual basis with our auditors as well, that their interpretation of something is vastly different to ours, and that creates difficulty. So that's my first question. And then my second goes back to what several people have mentioned in terms of professionalization and the need for qualifications for our staff. So I think we're all aware of the seeming impasse that has existed within the HEI space for a couple of years, while the move to professionalize public sector procurement has been high on the agenda. And I understand that several HEIs are going to be launching their BComs in supply chain shortly, for public procurement, I specifically mean. But my concern is to what extent those qualifications are going to need to be revised, or whether there might be a recurring impasse in light of the regulatory change, and what the knock-on effect of that is going to be on the professionalization of supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you, Santi.
Thanks, Santi. Yeah, so on those two questions, firstly, the consultative implementation, I think is spot on. And I think there's been a lot in the discussions that I've at least been involved in. There's been a lot of talk around that we can't go on with this open-ended, extremely vague regulatory environment. It's just not helpful. We need to tighten it up. And one of the ways of tightening it up would be to create, let's call it a kind of a clearinghouse, where you would get definitive interpretations, a little bit like you've got in the tax context, where you can approach SARS for a directive. And again, this is something that I think one should very seriously try and build within this regulatory agency that's going to deal with procurement. That's going to be the let's put it in that way, the owner of this piece of legislation, to build in the power to say, look, there can be definitive interpretation. However, of course, that would always remain challenging, because in our system, at least, our courts claim for themselves the exclusive power to be the final legal interpreter. So you can never really get away from that reality, but you can at least at an administrative level get to a point where there's a definitive interpretation by a statutorily mandated entity, and then all the administrative players are bound by that interpretation, including the auditors. And I think that's a very important mechanism to think about. I think another way to just take the pressure off the uncertainty is to kind of reduce the legal status or the legal implications of some of these instruments. And it brings us back to the conversation we've just had. Everything doesn't have to be in a binding legal instruction, because that's what creates the problem. If it's a guideline, if it's a circular, it's not a binding legal instruction. You look at it, you say, okay, this makes sense, we're going to follow it. But if we don't follow it, either by choice or by oversight, then that doesn't yet mean that my procurement is now invalid and can be set aside by a court, or my expenditure is now irregular, because it's not a binding legal instrument that I've not followed. And I think the quicker we move to that space, the better it will be for the entire system. And then on professionalization, yes, unfortunately, and I mean, I'm sitting in that exact position because I run 2 postgraduate qualifications in public procurement law. Undoubtedly, this overhaul of the regulatory system is going to have a major knock-on effect on what we all do. But reading between the lines, I suspect that it's going to be, the effect is going to be more on the kind of content or substance of the training, of the kind of training opportunities, rather than the whole thing. So I think we'll have to adjust content, but I don't think we will probably have to adjust kind of major design of a course or major design of a program. Those can remain. What we do within it, we will have to adjust. But that, again, is why this window of opportunity that we're in at the moment is such an important one. We need to get it right now, and we need to tie it down now, because we can't be in forever this open-ended space of, you know, a new regulation might come in, or a new act, or this is only ever now a temporary holding pattern. We need to get to a point where we say, this is our system, and we're going to commit to the system now for, let's say, 10 years or whatever. And we've got that window now. And if we can get that right, it should help us also put our professionalization attempts on a more stable basis.
Thanks, Prof. We've got 3 more folk who want to ask questions, but we are past 11:30.
No, sure. It's let me hang on a bit longer.
Thank you. Let's go ahead, Chris, and then we'll go to Philip, and then Ron.
Thanks, Sean, and morning, Prof Geo.
Hi, Chris.
I've been thinking long and hard about where should the reporting line be, and actually there is so much evidence outside of, you know, where we sit and the way we're doing things that points to the direction that a procurement function should, in fact, you know, there's a debate, should it be CEO, CFO, or COO, and most, and if not all, pointers indicate to likely that the procurement should report to the person responsible for operations and delivery. And that would, in a corporate environment, be COO. So that is classically the case in corporates. In our public procurement system, it therefore brings into question, you know, why we so sort of hung up on having it reside within National Treasury, when really National Treasury's role is to manage the finances, manage the purse strings, and of course a healthy process is the departments and the entities responsible for delivery submit their budgets, and they must manage and be held accountable for that. And otherwise you're always going to get Treasury sitting there and saying, well, hold on, we're a bit short of money. Let's take a little bit from Peter to pay Paul, and so on. So there's always that risk, and then delivery sort of suffers. I'm not sure, of course, if at all times, you know, in our public sector entities, there's a proper holistic budgeting process, because all too often you find that projects are implemented to a point, and then suddenly somebody realizes, hold on, we don't have any more money, and then it stops. So, you know, I like the procurement agency, and I've actually been thinking, you know, whether that shouldn't be located somewhere and reporting to the minister in the office of the presidency, you know, part of M&E, because their role there is not to do the implementation, it's to exercise the oversight, provide the guidelines, and make sure that the entities are sticking to rules and implementing as they should be. So that's one area, the reporting lines. But now we come to the other issue, which I think many have ventilated, yourself too, is the necessary skills mix. I think while we are debating this legislation, we have a much larger problem, because as one of the earlier speakers said, that we don't have the people with the necessary skills mix. And there's been all but talk of it. I mean, at the moment, you know, the training is in short supply. Most of the training that is available is linked to somebody becoming a buyer, supply chain manager, which often is not far-reaching enough. It may give you some of the strategic concepts. And you know, there are two ways of covering that, is to either look at having a base of a specific technical skill and then a bolt-on procurement body of knowledge that then, you know, can easily be translated into a skill. Or alternately, what was mooted some time back was to really have proper cross-functional teams working. I think the supply chain working to the exclusion of your technical end user departments has not been healthy in terms of the decision that's being made. Because we gravitate, as another one of your speakers said, was to least cost. Least cost doesn't necessarily translate into the appropriate quality and value for money. And this area, yeah, which I think is where our biggest spend is the in infrastructure, in IT systems, and then of course capital equipment, where the mind boggles that a large entity buys locomotives at huge cost and doesn't look at the total cost of ownership. What about the maintenance? So now they don't get spares because they didn't build that into the procurement framework that makes that automatic. So there's huge opportunities. And then the one last point I'd like to share is within all of this, and again, I think, you know, we're not talking about protected disclosure, but it's more about protecting officials who want to do the right thing, because it is the right thing. But most are on the back foot because you have an Auditor General's office that tends to look at things in straight lines and only interprets black and white. There's no gray. Now, you've got to make room for people in this process to do the right thing, because that's what Section 217 says. If it's justifiably cost effective, then it's likely the right thing. But in the procurement realm, and all the motivation is there. But the opposite now becomes true because of this great fear of individuals being held liable in their person. So the result is nothing will get done because people are unfortunately now scared off by that overzealous, short-sighted approach. So I think there are many players that need to be brought into the space if we're going to fix it. I really don't believe that it's properly resided in National Treasury in totality. Thank you, Geo and Sean.
Thank you, Chris.
Absolutely, Chris. I mean, I think you're spot on. And I think, as you've now also in your closing remark, I think that is really the gist of it. And I fully agree that I think within our current institutional architecture, the most sensible place is probably under the presidency. I don't know. I mean, I do like the idea of a freestanding body, perhaps directly accountable to Parliament. But I think the key really is, how do we operationalize this idea of multifunctional teams? And you're absolutely spot on. I mean, the literature is very clear, best practice worldwide, both public and private sectors, very clear that you can only get it right if multifunctional team working on the project. That it's the only way.
Yeah.
So the question then becomes, how do we institutionally make that work? How do we don't just say, look, this is a principle and we like all bid specification committees to be multifunctional, blah, 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 all of that. It's never going to happen just off, you know, organically. You have to design it. You have to be intentional. And it starts at the macro level. It starts with conceptualizing this entire function in that way. And I think that's why you're absolutely spot on in saying, as long as we continue to conceptualize it and thus place it only within Treasury, we are going to miss that trick. We are not going to get it right. So the starting point in, and somebody said on the chat as well, a very valid point. The starting point is constituting a proper multifunctional regulator, right? So right at the top, conceptualizing the whole function in that way, which must also mean not simply taking the people currently in the OCPO and moving them into a new thing. They must be complemented by people from other environments. For example, a lot of people will have to come from the public works space because they're a key player in SEM, and yet I don't think that they are playing at the moment a dominant role in shaping our SEM. But if you look at the figures, if you look at the amount of money, it makes no sense not to have built environment, public works in the public sector kind of people there. Same with IT, same with many other areas. So at the macro level of the design, the regulatory design, you need to already have that. And then I think you've got perhaps a chance of that notion filtering through within individual entities, where we can then start to have a proper conversation about, should we have a CPO role as a standard feature of the South African public administration landscape? Yes or no? And if the answer is no, then we should be able to say to each other, okay, so what is the alternative reporting line? You know, who is the chief operating officer within our classic understanding of public administration in South Africa? And I think those are absolutely the correct questions to ask. Thanks, Chris.
Absolutely. Good one. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Prof. Philip, quick one, and then we'll go to Ron.
Thanks very much, Sean. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. A very insightful engagement and presentations here. One wonders around whether it matters not whether your procurement functions at the central level or sit across the entire matrix organization, but with a particular responsibility or accountability. Almost all procurement processes or procedures or anything that you can think about are transversal activities across any enterprise. The question then becomes, who's then the accounting body or accounting authority, accounting responsibility when the popo is the fan? Or alternatively, who's responsible for really performance outcomes and performance impact? Also noting the fact that various sections or departments would have their own strategic programs, operational plans in terms of what they want to procure, how do they want to procure it. I'm of the view that a centralized function may operate, but with a decentralized operating model that actually then recognizes or responds to the multifunctional discipline that will actually pull across all the competences across SCM and deal with a number of challenges. My only issue of concern remains old ethical leadership. SCM is actually littered or compromised by a number of folks. When you call it from a set of directives, circulars, and so on, corruption, environment, or corrosive practices, and so on, will remain with challenges in SCM. It will never matter whether centralized or not centralized. So it's the question of who's in charge of the organization. Is the CEO or the chief procurement officer? And the fights that actually ensue when the government's left. I view that the governance model of some care must be looked at. If you look at thousands and thousands of circulars and directives issued by either provincial treasury, national treasury, and a number of HSA report, telephone reports, risk management reports, there should have been a body of knowledge that the procurement bill would depart from. Yeah, for me, that therefore suggests that there may need to be another engagement with specifically what's expressly planned or directed to procurement officials who are able to guide National Treasury with the practical experiences as it happens.
Thanks, Philip. You're fading there. I think you were just making some comments there around the centralization, decentralization model. But your line is going there quite badly, Philip. Sorry, man. Let's just quickly ask Ron for one or two closing comments. I know that Prof Geo needs to leave in the next 2 minutes, Prof. Ron, so maybe just a quick comment, quick question.
Prof, if we wanted to get a copy of the draft procurement bill, how do we go about it? And what is our probability of success? And secondly, if we wanted to table a citizens procurement bill in Parliament, how do we go about that? Thanks.
Thanks, Ron. Well, I mean, I don't know how to get a copy of the current version out in public. I think the chances are probably very, very slim because it's at the cabinet level now. And traditionally, when that happens, one gets nothing out of government before it's passed through Parliament. And then after that, they will probably tell you that it's heading to Parliament, just wait. But I mean, one can always put in an access to information request to National Treasury and ask them to make it. But I think the chances are very slim just in this moment in time, because I think that the argument is it's before cabinet, and cabinet documents are generally protected from general disclosure. As to submitting a different bill, I mean, it's an idea that I've played with quite a bit. Actually went so far as having some conversations with some MPs about bringing a private members bill. The problem that we keep running into, and I must say we've not resolved it because we've not really kind of discussed it all the way, is the question whether the restriction on the submission of money bills that is in the Constitution, which says that only the Minister of Finance may do that, would apply to this particular bill. And I mean, there's a little bit of technical interpretation required there to interpret whether this thing, the procurement bill, will actually fit that category. But short of that, the way to do it would be to get a member of Parliament to simply sponsor a private members bill. And if they can get it in, then Parliament must deal with it. Parliament is then seized with the matter. They must deal with it. But I think given where we are at the moment, given that the president is now set, look, within the next, let's say, 4 months, we will see a bill being tabled. I think that's most likely the first thing that's going to happen just chronologically. And then once that's happened, then we must engage with that bill that's before Parliament. Parliament must then engage with it. And then our input is then in terms of engaging with that bill. That doesn't mean that one can't then go in and say completely kind of, you know, cut this whole chapter out, replace it with this, whatever. You can basically rewrite the whole thing if you can get Parliament to agree with you. But you will have to kind of play that document out throughout the entire process before you will be able to do anything else.
Thanks very much, Prof. Huge thanks to you for your time, your insights, your contribution today, and very insightful. So the big thing that we're going to be looking out for then is that instruction that's probably coming out in January on restrictions and debarment. And then we're going to have to wait to see what comes into the bill.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will, Sean, I will email you my slides. You're welcome to distribute on the platform.
Appreciate
and then I think we should say to each other in this forum, look, the first one that gets wind of a bill having, you know, arrived in Parliament should shout, so that we can make that well known. and absolutely that we can then collaborate also as far as possible to get comments in to really workshop it. Regardless of what Parliament's own processes might be, there's no reason why one couldn't, you know, behind that also engage quite robustly and try and insert something in the parliamentary process.